If you're on social media, you'll almost certainly have seen them. Idyllic picnics in parks and gardens, piles of bread, pies and fruit, people in earth-toned folk costume running through the grass barefoot. But why, out of all the fantasy options, why hobbits? And why now? Hi, I'm Ash. On this channel we talk about the fun of costuming and live-action roleplay, and also sometimes the social impact of those two things. So join me as we take a deep dive into all things concerning hobbits. A couple of quick notes before we begin. One, there will be no direct spoilers for Rings of Power if I can manage it, but we will be talking in depth about the contents of both the books of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and the Peter Jackson movies. Two, I am not an academic. I am a LARPer with an anthropology degree. This is something I think is interesting and more complex than people realise and touches on a bunch of stuff I'm particularly interested in, but there are sections of this where I am well out of my depth. If some bits are heavily sourced historical facts and other bits are just vibes, sorry. Three, if you are unhappy with the Rings of Power on the grounds that some of the actors are people of colour, you're a racist and you're gonna hate this video. Arguing that that's not how Tolkien wrote those characters just means you think Tolkien was also a racist, and well, we'll talk about that in a bit. If you're gonna whinge about how elves and dwarves shouldn't be black in the comments section, you're gonna get blocked. Save us both some time and leave now. Honestly, if you're going to complain about the boy elves not being hot enough, I think we're watching different shows. Anyway, hobbitcore, so named as a subset of cottagecore, is a recent addition from the whirlwind internet aesthetic generator. While influencers like Rachel Maxey have been enthusiastically enjoying at least the fashion side of things for over 3 years, it's really been this year, 2022, where we've seen a big rise in people, for example, dressing up and having Instagrammable picnics or running LARP events. Hobbitcore has a few major distinctions from cottagecore that you'll notice immediately, and some that are more subtle. The fashion tends to be more earth-toned, with greens, creams and browns, without so much of the pastel pinks and lavenders you get in more traditional cottagecore. Baking and cooking is still a huge focus, but there's less emphasis on the handmade preparation of beautiful food, and more on the sharing of delicious but potentially store-bought meals. These meals often also feature group activities like playing music and dancing, or individual pleasures like reading, rather than focusing on practical work like crafts and tending gardens. Hobbitcore events are almost always a coming together of a community, rather than an idyllic but potentially isolated lifestyle. Also, in Hobbit events, you'll often see people of all genders and children, both surprisingly uncommon in cottagecore, which often favours young adult women. The idealised lifestyle of a Hobbit obviously comes directly from the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, but where does this unified visual aesthetic come from? Well, if you make an era-defining trilogy of movies, people who grew up with them tend to have strong feelings. I think it's really key that the resurgence of Hobbit enthusiasm is happening now, over 20 years since the movies came out, because the people dressing up like hobbits often saw these films on release when they were between the ages of 7 and 15. It's not like hobbits are the only aesthetic in the Lord of the Rings trilogy though. While they don't spend a lot of time, or any time really, on dwarves, we see a plethora of elves, 2 different nations of men, the forces of Mordor, and a whole bunch of other distinctly costumed characters. Over a decade ago, when costumers stepped into Middle-earth, they'd traditionally gone for the long flowing robes and dresses of the elves, or the pseudo-Viking horse girl aesthetic of Rohan. Gondor frequently gets left out, but personally I think Peter Jackson asked the aesthetic of Gondor a bit. It's not bad, it's just underwhelming. In my video about fantasy costuming on the whole, I talked a little about Lord of the Rings and how, while the costumes are undeniably fantasy, they've taken elements from history as inspiration. Celtic knots and hanging sleeves abound, there's velvets, furs and rich embroidery, a whole plethora of armour styles. Each nation of Middle-earth is not only distinct, but especially in the case of Gondor and Rohan, visually tied into the idea of a mythic Northern European past by drawing on recognisable medieval and earlier visual elements. So, where do the hobbits fit? In that video I also talked about how in the early days of fantasy movies and Renaissance fairs, where we didn't really know how to do fantasy and were making it up out of things that were easily available, people turned to European folk costume as something that looked kind of old-fashioned, but also you could just buy. And the Hobbit aesthetic is low-key hilarious to me because that's exactly what it is. It's either breeches, waistcoats and jackets, or full gathered skirts, aprons, blouses, dresses and bodices or stays. That's pan-Northern European folk costume in a nutshell. It doesn't draw on the medieval period, it draws on the 18th century at best. I think it's a testament to how well executed the Lord of the Rings movies are, aesthetically, that they do this, and it just works. The Shire is its own little microcosm, mostly unknown to the rest of Middle-earth, so having a distinct style makes sense, but also visually the hobbits never seem all that out of place among the Fellowship. One of the great joys of fantasy costuming is taking two seemingly disparate inspirations and making them work side by side, because if you follow the little rules of world building, you can actually break a lot of the big ones. But equally, I can completely see how this makes the hobbits the most accessible costume out of the movies. You can just buy this stuff. It or things like it are still worn and readily available. The same is not true of long-sleeved medieval-style gowns. The real question is, why now? Why haven't people been doing this all along? I also don't think we can get much further through this video without talking about some of the critiques and considerations, some of Tolkien's work in general, and some of the actual act of Hobbit play. As someone from a live-action roleplay background, I'm always very conscious of the inherent tensions in costumed or embodiment play, the act of dressing up as or pretending to be another person. Just because you can pretend to be anyone, does that mean you have the right to? What experiences is it acceptable for you to have a watered-down weekend-long play around in, and when is that inappropriate or even harmful? Many people will claim that engaging in play as marginalized identities or experiences of hardship and discrimination is a great way to learn and build empathy and awareness around those experiences. But there's not actually a lot of research evidence that that actually works, and the considerations of people who genuinely have those experiences, who might be at the same event, are not always consulted. Are hobbits marginalized, though? For this, I think we need to step out of Middle-earth and into mid-20th century Britain and New Zealand in the late 90s. Firstly, we need to talk about size and disability politics, which is not my field, but I'm going to try and at least superficially do it justice. In the world of Middle-earth, all hobbits are inherently of short stature. In order to recreate this for the movies, Peter Jackson could have chosen little people to play those characters, and he kind of did. The faces of the hobbits we know are all actors of average height, but in scenes where hobbits and humans or elves appear in the same shot, people of short stature or very tall people were used as stand-ins, and then, when necessary, the average-sized actors were CGI'd over the top. The success of Lord of the Rings, in part, contributed to this being a practice that continued in cinema. For example, in Snow White and the Huntsman, that came out in 2012, almost 10 years after The Lord of the Rings. An indelible part of cinema for some time, that disabled people were useful for their bodies, but not their faces or acting ability. It's an ongoing part of the history of cinema that the big-budget film industrial complex that we generally just call Hollywood, even though that's not really a good descriptor anymore, is extremely bad at employing and representing actors with disabilities, and is actually getting worse. As far as I know, the film that still holds the record for the largest number and most diverse representation of disabled actors in a single production is the 1932 horror movie Freaks. Good movie, but that is ridiculous. Right up to date in 2022, we're still having arguments about whether disabled characters should be played by disabled people. It's not an argument, they should be. And whether abled people can tell stories about disability, which maybe, but let's be honest, they're almost always just bad and inaccurate to the point of being harmful. Maybe this is less a question of can and more a question of should. But hobbits aren't little people. They're hobbits. In the Shire, they aren't disabled by their height because everyone is the same height and everything is scaled appropriately. It's only when they leave the Shire and travel into other lands that they face issues. It's a nice allegory for the societal model of disability, but does that mean that when you and all your friends dress up as hobbits, you are all just assumed to be hobbit-sized, with hobbit-sized houses and cooking utensils, with no average height people around? Are you overwriting a character of short stature with your average height body? Is there room for little people in hobbit play? Does LARPing as a person of short stature have the capacity to cause harm? I don't have good answers for this. I want to say this isn't a reason you shouldn't dress up like a hobbit, but I don't actually have the right to say that. I've not found anyone saying that this does cause harm, but I'm just one person with Google. Overall, the question of, is it okay that I portray this character, does need to be asked, especially when that portrayal is highly visible. For example, if it's going to end up on social media. Now, that was a very serious subject, and so in order to maintain everyone's attention span, we should move on to something more light-hearted. Or we could branch out from purely hobbits and tackle the elephant in the room that hangs over literally every Tolkien discussion ever and has done for decades. Let's talk about race. I don't want to get overly into racism in Lord of the Rings, not because it's not present or not important. It is and it is. But there are people of colour who've done a much better job of this than I could, and I'm going to link you to their work instead. Certainly I want to flag up that it's not just that the original text is open to racist readings. And have you heard the story about how the Peter Jackson production was so desperate for extras they put out a lot of general calls for anyone they could get, including a call for anyone with their own horse, and so in the big battle scenes a lot of the riders of Rohan are actually women. Turns out they actually had lots of Maori extras. They just only wanted to cast them as orcs. God damn it, Peter. What I'm going to focus on in this segment, however, is how race is conceptualized in Lord of the Rings. Something that has gone on to, I believe, significantly harm fantasy as a genre for decades. Which I guess means we're also going to have to talk about the birth of medievalism and, brace yourself, this section is going to get wild. Let's start with the basics. In the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, elves, dwarves, men, hobbits, orcs, and a scattered few other minor groups are described as races. They're not races. Species is probably a better shot at describing these groups, but race was the word Tolkien used, and that's the word that basically everyone from major fantasy authors to Dungeons and Dragons has continued to use. And it's really problematic. The way race, real-life human race, was conceptualized in the 19th and early 20th centuries was incredibly harmful, as white, colonialist, overwhelmingly but not entirely men tried to essentially justify white supremacy and colonial rule. In their scholarship, black and brown people had to be physiologically different from white people to explain why white cultures were allowed to have invaded and occupied their lands and stolen their labor. They must be inherently less intelligent, less cultured, less disciplined and dedicated, more inclined towards primitive and barbaric practices. Once the vocabulary was introduced into the popular lexicon, less evolved. It couldn't be that white oppression had harmed these people in completely unacceptable ways. They had to be genetically predisposed that way. There was a level of nuance distinguishing primarily black and indigenous peoples who were considered to be primitive and never having progressed, and the so-called Oriental cultures who were once great but had declined and failed and regressed. That includes Egypt, which is going to get real relevant in about 5 minutes. But let me be really explicit. Overwhelmingly, the way white people wrote about and conceptualized race was to justify racism. It was to hold forth the worldview that white supremacy was in fact the natural order of things and indeed the best possible outcome for everyone. Even that people of color benefited from being oppressed, murdered, and enslaved. They frequently co-opted scientific language in order to do so, and because of that, many of those ideas and prejudices have persisted into the modern day, some more subtly than others. Some not subtly at all. TSR. Now, to be fair, they didn't have to persist very far for Tolkien. He was a contemporary of many of these ideas, and his field of medieval studies, which only really begins to exist in the 18th century, is steeped in them. And when he and we today describe elves and dwarves and humans as races, with the assumption that your race will describe your culture, your physiology, as it differs from other races, what you're naturally good or bad at, who you're able to have children with, and what those children are, and the assumption that one of these is default, it's not good. It's not good. Side note, taking this to gender, because, hi, it's me, I talk about gender. The same early 20th century writers were super big on the gender binary and homophobia, and used the same framework to enforce it. Having a high level of differentiation between the only two genders was held up as a mark of being more evolved, and they basically just talked shit about everyone who wasn't a gender-conforming cis-het white person off the back of that. Black women were too masculine, Chinese men were too effeminate, as were white homosexuals who were a sign of degeneracy and had to be fixed or removed in order to preserve white racial purity. Never study history, kids, it's eugenics most of the way down. These ideas have also persisted into the modern day. You can probably think of examples, shape the way gender is talked about, and cause measurable harm, which... Okay, given how dedicated adaptations of Tolkien are to the aesthetic of all elves, all being willowy, long-haired and delicate, all dwarves being burly and hairy, and there being no female orcs, bit awkward. Like, it's not that I don't support those as aesthetic choices. 100% here for luxurious beards and androgynous waifs. Gender is a construct. It's just something I think we should be conscious of. The nations and groups in The Lord of the Rings also have some parallels to the real world, some of which Tolkien's notes indicate was done deliberately, and they're for various reasons, not super great. The nation of Rohan draws heavily on Tolkien's historical work into the medieval period and texts like Beowulf. They essentially use Old English and are positioned in terms of influences somewhere between post-Roman, pre-Norman conquest Britain and Norse Scandinavia. While this is an important part of European history and many people's heritage, including mine, it routinely gets co-opted by racists with a very twisted idea of what that period and those peoples were like. And we know Tolkien knew that, okay? You can't fight in one world war and live through another and not learn that the Nazis loved Wagner. It's not even that Tolkien was a contemporary of National Socialism. Medieval studies in the 19th and 20th century was intensely obsessed with national identity and the celebration and preservation of it. It's not my field, so my scholarship falls down a little here, so the best example I can give you is that a couple of prominent 19th century medievalists were apparently convinced that homosexuality had to be introduced to Britain by foreigners, and would actively overlook or suppress actual sources that contradicted that. Either it was picked up in the Crusades or the Normans brought it, but absolutely no good pure-blooded Anglo-Saxon boys could possibly have been having sexy feelings for each other without those evil foreigners and their terrible plague of sodomy. Anglo-Saxons aren't real. We don't have time. Actual medieval sources made it very clear they knew about homosexuality and same-sex practices. It comes up in stories, and yeah, it was a sin, but sin was talked about at some length in medieval literature. It was heavily codified at the time, and it's all spelled out in the list of penances in quite some detail. Like, you can't just confess you had sex with a man. You have to tell the nice monk exactly where you put it so they can give you the right penance. The medieval period is just really sexy, all of the time. Speaking of foreigners, and returning to Tolkien, the Haradrim, or Southrons, are brown-skinned and dark-haired and have a harsh, ugly-sounding language and literal elephants. They're also evil. It's just bad. Which isn't to say that Tolkien was unilaterally just racist, especially if you're going to use that as justification as to why a dwarf princess can't be black. But he was a white British man. He benefited from and almost certainly bought into, even unconsciously, racist structures. He was also kind of pro-empire, which... People often want to be able to call it one way or the other, racist or not racist, but there is a big space between actively persecuting people of colour and being actively and outspokenly anti-racist. Tolkien wrote some anti-racist things, largely in letters. He essentially told his German publishers to get stuffed when they asked about his heritage. He was against apartheid, although he doesn't seem to have done much to actively oppose it, but equally made the explicitly North African-inspired people in Lord of the Rings fundamentally evil. He also, famously, turned down Stuart Hall for postgraduate study. I'm not in a position to determine whether Tolkien just didn't want a black Jamaican studying medieval English literature, or if Hall, who would go on to describe Thatcherism, massively contribute to leftist political theory, and be one of the most influential contributors to the emerging field of post-colonial studies, just screwed up the interview for some reason. What we can do is say, well, what if that decision was motivated by racism? What would that mean? What is the impact here? With someone as famous and well-respected as Tolkien, and as influential a scholar as Hall turned out to be, the impact is potentially quite a lot. Moving back to Middle-earth, you'd be forgiven for thinking Gondor was less directly influenced by the real world because the Peter Jackson movies kinda asked it, but Tolkien's notes identified it with Mediterranean states, Italy, Greece, the Ottoman Empire, and Numenor, with which everyone is now significantly more familiar, thank God, with Egypt, which, on the surface, great. Two highly developed and noble states, clearly influenced by cultures that even in popular imagination have some level of racial diversity. I'm not going to spend a long time unpacking why making the most socially and technologically developed nation of men the natural leaders of the continent, literally Romans, is a bit fucking Oxford, man. I can't. But let's just take a minute to focus on Numenor, the ancient seat of great knowledge and power, the humans who are just better than all the other humans because they chose to fight for good instead of for evil, and now they live 3 times as long or something, and who are missing from the world by the end of the Third Age and the events of Lord of the Rings. Only their distant heir and a few shreds of their knowledge and power left to make sure that Aragorn is just the best, and obviously should be king of everyone. Again, we have to look not at our modern understanding of ancient Egypt, because when Tolkien says Egypt, he almost certainly means pyramids and pharaohs. Very few, even modern historians, want to take an interest in Egypt as a contemporary developed state with its own rich culture and beautiful complexities. Orientalism. But at how Egypt was popularly understood in the first half of the 20th century, and I'm going to have to talk about Aleister Crowley in a video about Hobbit picnics. So the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, right, was a pop magic cult in the late 19th and early 20th century. To be absolutely clear, Tolkien was not a member. One, he was too young, they'd splintered by the end of the First World War, and two, he was almost certainly not posh enough to have been considered. But one of the writers he greatly respected, W.B. Yeats, definitely was. And was in fact the person responsible for kicking Aleister Crowley out of it, administratively and literally. Most of this isn't relevant, but it's important to know that they existed, that the things they did and believed got around, and I don't want to say foundations because that sounds less literally made up, but the construction of some of their beliefs. For example, if I say think of a tarot card, you're almost certainly imagining something from the Rider and Waite deck illustrated by Pamela Colman Smith, all members of the Golden Dawn. Tarot cards have been in use as a gaming deck and as cartomancy for hundreds of years, originating in Italy, but Rider, Waite and Colman Smith wanted to create their own deck because tarot contained the magical wisdom of the ancient Egyptians, but had been corrupted over time as it was mindlessly replicated by their orientalized descendants, the Roma, and they wanted to refine and purify it. Fucking hell. I shouldn't have to say that all of that is bullshit, right? But it was very pervasive bullshit. You can trace a direct line between that flavour of bullshit and, like, ancient aliens. And that's why when I found out that Tolkien's race of ancient philosopher kings is supposedly inspired by Egypt, in light of all that, the Hobbits potentially come off the best here. They're not written as pasty white as they end up being in the movies. The text makes it very clear a number of them are, at the very least, kind of tan. And the Shire isn't a specific place or a specific time so much as it's the England Tolkien remembers from his childhood. An England that never really existed except through the eyes of a young boy. If you've had a rural or semi-rural upbringing, especially a British one, and you've ever thought, things just aren't the way they were when I was little? The summers were longer and hotter, the countryside more vibrant, the birds sang brighter, the berries on the hedgerows were sweeter, the leaves in autumn perfect and crisp, and the snow in winter fresh and exciting every time. That's the Shire. It's not a real place, and it never really was. And yet, I grew up in a series of semi-rural communities in England, and while there were all the good hallmarks of the Shire, I had access to fields and woodlands, gardens, green spaces, animals, even quaint old buildings sometimes. There were also the bad ones. A distrust of outsiders, which manifested as anyone not like us, whether you were from 2 towns over, or the north, or were brown, or gay. The pressure to mind your own business, coupled with incessant gossip. A succession of unwritten social rules and hierarchies. Intense territorialism, especially over public and shared spaces. An obsession with class, income, and social strata and how that displayed itself. Underage drinking, racism, sexism, ableism, and overall lack of prospects and room for development, infrastructure underfunding, an intense suspicion of new technologies and any kind of change. I'm not saying the Hobbits are working class Tory voters, but I can see why people assume that. Side note here, I've seen a few people on the internet criticising The Hobbit by basically claiming that Bilbo is landed gentry. I actually disagree. For all their faults, there's no indication that hobbits have any form of class distinction. Sure, Bilbo lives off his inheritance and that one job, and just writes books. But Tolkien grew up poor and became an academic. Let the poor guy have his self-insert fantasy of a dedicated scholar who doesn't have to worry about money or teaching or university admin. The Shire does quite a good job, I think, of being a place that's perfect, as long as you belong there and it's enough for you. The fact that none of our Hobbit protagonists seek out adventure, but are called to it anyway, is telling. Possibly less of Tolkien's own experience than his time as an officer in the First World War, commanding mainly working-class men enlisted from small industrial towns in Lancashire. Which actually brings me on to one of the main issues addressed, even unconsciously, by Hobbit play. Capitalism, technology, and the environment. If you've only ever watched the movies of Lord of the Rings, you might be blissfully unaware that in the original text, evil makes it to the Shire. In fact, even if you did read the books, the scouring of the Shire is such a weird, fevered fever dream of an addendum to the story that you'd be forgiven for mentally editing it out. In the scouring, the hobbits return home to find that Saruman and Wormtongue reached the Shire and set about ruining it. Through the destruction of homes and trees, ugly new buildings, principally a mechanized mill, mass export of goods bought up with dirty money leading to shortages and starvation, and both a rising crime and an aggressive new police force with many new laws and rules, the main character hobbits organise their family and friends to rise up against the sheriffs. Wormtongue kills Saruman, is then shot with arrows. The hobbits put everything back to the way it was. Sam replants the trees and things are better than ever. It's basically just one massive fuck you capitalism. I do think it's unfair to use this as a basis to claim Tolkien was anti-technology. At least, he may have been in his time, but what technology looks like in Britain now, with widespread access to renewable energy, the internet, medical scanning and advanced testing, central heating, labour-saving home appliances, safer, cleaner industrial processes, and strict legislation protecting both people and the environment, is such a far cry from the front lines of mechanised warfare and the early 20th century industrial cities of Birmingham, Leeds and Oxford where Tolkien lived. Yes, Oxford was an industrial city. They built cars and still do, a thing many people choose to forget while staring at the pretty old buildings. That I'm just not sure it's a useful comparison to draw. I'm sure I don't need to describe the Somme to anyone, but my touchstone for just how bad industrial cities in Britain were is the poet George Worth, admittedly about 100 years earlier, who described his journey into Bradford in the north of England and the accompanying smoke and filth blotting out the sky as a descent into hell. And that was in 1844. The number of mills and factories in Bradford would increase tenfold over the next 60 years. The natural stone in Yorkshire is a sort of butter yellow, but you'd be forgiven for not knowing that, because every building that predates the Second World War is black. Put that back to back with the devastation and loss of life in the First and Second World Wars, and that industry that was measurably making people's lives worse and often significantly shorter, in the name of making the biggest amount of money for the smallest amount of people, you can see why Tolkien obviously hated it. Off the back of this, people often want to claim Tolkien as an environmentalist, and sure, the natural world is celebrated in his work, and he clearly cares about it. He made long-term close friend C.S. Lewis an insect character a literal talking tree. But the political construction of conservation didn't really exist yet, and he didn't seem to take much action to preserve the natural world in his personal life. I think reinterpreting Tolkien's work to claim it champions conservation is ignoring one of the key themes of Lord of the Rings, one of the themes that makes it so incredibly relevant to story today. I would argue that what we can read into the way he presents the natural world in the Lord of the Rings speaks to a slightly different emotional engagement than what we expect from environmental narratives. Environmentalist stories focus on preserving and celebrating the natural world in as close to its current, or sometimes even what's perceived to be its historic, state. Tolkien doesn't do that. Since we have mentioned the wars and we are talking about hobbits, we should talk about pastoralism. When I say pastoral art, I'm sure a lot of you are like, yeah, 18th and 19th century glorification of peasants and the rural idyll. There's probably some fat cows and a beautiful maiden in a kerchief, and you're not wrong. There's absolutely some elements of that, and the way the Shire is styled in the Peter Jackson movies totally draws on those influences. But that's not the pastoralism I'm actually talking about. Instead, I want to focus on 20th century pastoralism, like a particularly famous piece of music. The Lark Ascending by Ralph Vaughan Williams was composed just before the start of the First World War and first performed in the 1920s. And to me it really typifies some of the sadness about early 20th century pastoralism that sits between and after the World Wars. It's difficult to romanticize farming when everyone you know is trying to grow vegetables so they don't starve. It's nearly impossible to dream of rolling French fields when you can witness them turned to mud and barbed wire and shell craters. The natural world becomes something idyllic and cherished and beautiful because it's gone, because we destroyed it. The Scouring makes it very clear that the Shire can be put back to how it was after the horrors of war. It's a narrative of return and renewal on a very small scale. But the same is not exactly true for Middle-earth as a whole. The Fourth Age is welcomed in, the Age of Men begins, the rightful king returned and evil vanquished, but the Third Age still ends. With the One Ring broken, the power of the Elven Rings will fail. Rivendell and Lothlorien cannot be sustained. The elves will leave Middle-earth forever, and the last of the wizards with them. The dwarves will never reclaim Moria or their former glory, and will too eventually withdraw underground and pass out of memory. The trees may never wake again, and there will be no more Ents. There will be no more dragons, no more orcs, no more giants. no more powerful artifacts or great quests. The world will survive. It will continue for thousands of years and make many more great kings and queens, happy and fulfilled people, long lives lived and celebrated in a world that isn't bad, it's actually pretty good. But some of the wonder and magic will forever have left it. The Middle-earth of Lord of the Rings is Middle-earth as good as it's ever going to be, ever again. And this is what I think makes The Lord of the Rings still relevant, and why it's a story that we've all decided to come back to right about now. Because I don't know if you've noticed this, but the Earth is dying. I'm not a fatalist when it comes to the environment, but I'm also not an idealist. We as a species have already, to use the technical term, fucked it. We can't roll that back as much as we try, and we should still try. It's real bad. We need to fix this as much as it's possible to fix. This cannot get worse. But humans are tenacious, and I'm extremely privileged. I have reasonable confidence that not only will I personally have an okay standard of living for most of my life, but that my children and grandchildren will too. The same is not true for millions of people, and we need to take action for their sake. Don't get me wrong. Complacency is not an option. Even if things get worse, I'm still pretty sure my children will have an okay life, potentially even a great life. It's just that it'll be a life in a world with more natural disasters, more flooding and drought, less food security. They'll have to live with stricter guidelines around food and water and energy. They'll grow up in a world without coral reefs, polar bears, puffins, sea turtles. Is a life without coral reefs worth living? Yes, probably. A coral reef has never made an active impact on my life other than made me look at a video and go, yeah, that's cool. Is a world without coral reefs a world worth living in? Probably yes. Is a world without coral reefs less for having lost them? Absolutely. Some of the wonder will have forever left this world and we'll never be able to get it back. So why hobbits? Against everything that is happening at the end of the Third Age, the War of the Ring, the elves leaving, the return of the king, the hobbits don't care. The hobbits don't care. The Shire goes back to the way it was, better even, and the events of the rest of the world pass the hobbits by without much notice, and the hobbits are happy. It does not change their lives one bit that the elves have left, or the trees gone silent, or the age of men has begun. And while that's not the best attitude to have while facing down a climate crisis, it's becoming increasingly obvious that we've all been consistently lied to by capitalism for decades. The idea of a personal carbon footprint was invented by a fossil fuel company. We as individuals can't make the kind of structural changes needed with just our own actions. Join a union and register to vote, folks. We just get all of the anxiety and none of the ability to fix anything. But if any one of us was put in a room and told, hey, you can fix the world's problems. You just need to go on an incredibly hard and dangerous quest. It'll suck the whole time and you might die, but it'll fix everything and lots of people will die if you don't. I want to believe most of us are going to say yes. I think we'd all like to believe we'd say yes. Roleplay can be fun, but it can also be cathartic and it can be healing. Being able to step back from the real world, the climate crisis, the collapse of late-stage capitalism and spiraling costs of living, regular outbreaks of racially motivated violence, rampant transphobia, a literal land war in Europe that's got an actual unstable nuclear reactor in the middle of it, and the still ongoing pandemic. Seriously, as someone whose important doctor's appointments keep getting rescheduled to months later, please wear a damn mask in public spaces. All that is more than it's reasonable to expect any person to deal with. We have a mental health crisis right now, with more people than ever seeking and usually not receiving help. So yes, fuck it. Take an afternoon, dress up like a hobbit. Celebrate home and hearth and food and found family and not having to worry about the weight of the world's problems. Rest. Heal. It won't fix anything, except maybe you. A little bit. And I fundamentally don't think that's a bad thing, because we all know, deeply, passionately, we all know, that hobbits do not seek out adventure, but when adventure calls, they answer. Hobbits don't want to be heroes, but if they have to, they'll be the best damn heroes there has ever been. We should all aspire to be hobbits. Thank you for putting up with my budget Rowan Ellis impression for however long this video ends up being. This is not my normal style of content. I usually make stuff or talk about how you LARP, but if you enjoyed this and want to hear more of my big roleplay related thoughts, let me know. I pay extra attention to your comments if you support me on Ko-fi. That's a lie, but you know the drill. Subscribe if you'd like to see more of this sort of thing, like and comment to keep the YouTube gods happy. Follow me on Instagram to see pictures of my cat. Thank you to my Ko-fi supporters. You can join them by following the link in the description. It'll get you access to my videos 24 hours before everyone else. Go get yourself a drink and a pie and a nice place to have a nap. Dream big, and I'll see you next time. Best Lord of the Rings adaptations. 1, the BBC 13-part radio drama. 2, Tom Hardy's Lord of the Rings song. 3, the Peter Jackson movies. The Peter Jackson movies are Seriously though, if you have 5 minutes, go read out some of the newspaper articles from like 1999, 2000, before Fellowship came out. Every single one of them is like, now we're going to interview Peter Jackson, the man who is ruining Lord of the Rings. I know it's all bullshit, right? But I have a really rare family name that apparently shows up in historical documents around the Norman conquest in 1066, and I would like to take credit for my ancestors personally queering the entire British Isles, okay? Let me have this fantasy. Oh my god. I just wish, for once, I could enjoy a television program instead of having to deal with all the fucking snowflakes who are mad that they can't shut black people out of their special treehouse anymore. Especially when they're the same people whining because, I don't know, the show made Sauron too old and ugly. Like, that's not Sauron, you fool. Did you even read the appendices? Side note, if you're considering watching Snow White and the Huntsman, maybe just watch Mirror Mirror instead. It came out a few months earlier, and while it's far from perfect, it is a better movie in literally almost every single way. Better plot, better costumes, actual little people playing the Seven Dwarfs, calling folk out for ableist language. Sean Bean's in it, briefly. Solid 7 out of 10 production, ends on a dance number, lots to like. All of them. All the descriptions of Crowley getting kicked out of the Golden Dawn are by members of the Golden Dawn, so they're like super fucking melodramatic. You'd think they were actual wizards firing fireballs at each other, instead of a bunch of nerdy white dudes getting into it. The Battle of Blythe Road, a great clash between the magical forces of good and evil, or maybe just a really problematic dude getting kicked down some stairs, I don't know. Did anyone else have like a gender awakening at some point and then realise that The Lord of the Rings hits real different now? Cool. I am absolutely fucking loving Rings of Power, okay? And I want to watch it with people, but I'm also super aware that me and my partner are the worst people to watch it with because we're just Tolkien nerd enough to catch Easter eggs, but not Tolkien nerd enough to know exactly what's supposed to be going on, and we get rowdy, which is weird when the show is so serious and is like, Elrond, you know of the work of the great Lord Celebrimbor, and we're like, oh shit, that dude! Oh, this is gonna go so wrong. My money don't jiggle jiggle.